Hey, welcome back to the Andromedoom devlogs, episode number 4. If you'd like to skip ahead to the content, please check the timestamps in the description below. In this episode, I will be showing you how to set up projectiles, so the player fire and ultimately the alien fire as well. And in today's devlog for the Andromedoom main project, I'll be showing you the buildings that I've made for the remaining 4 levels in the Asia Pacific region. Alright, let's switch over to the screen. Okay, so this is where we left off last week. Now we want the player to fire when the spacebar is pressed and when there's a touchscreen button pressed. So step 1, let's set up an input for the fire. Let's call it action fire. Looks like I've already created that. Add physical key, press space and press OK. And that will map the spacebar to the fire action string. Okay, now let's set up a touchscreen button. So on our UI canvas, now I've got this control node here along the bottom edge of the screen. However, it's better if we just rename this to bottom left and keep this control node anchored to the bottom left corner. And then we'll add a new child node. Call it bottom right. And change it to the bottom right corner. With no margins. Okay, underneath here we're going to add a touchscreen button. Gonna call it fire button. Let's go over to our sprites. We've got the base, so the normal sprite texture, and the pressed sprite texture. And we're going to correct this transform position so it sits correctly on the screen. And I've showed you in the joystick tutorial how to change this in script dynamically, so that if you're loading different sized textures, you can guarantee that the button will always sit at the right location. So step 1 for setting up the projectiles is creating a scene that is a prefabricated projectile object. So let's click here to add a new scene. We'll make the root node a 3D scene, and let's change this type to a kinematic body. Call this projectile. Now I'm going to add a mesh instance for its appearance. It might be better in this instance to create a plane with a texture that is billboarded towards the camera, but for now we'll just work with this. Click on the mesh drop down and add a new cube mesh. Click into the mesh. And we'll adjust the sizes. It is best to always align your objects in the direction they move in the positive Z direction. That way when we use the move and collide function, we'll just say move towards vector 3.forward. And in moving in the forward direction, all we have to do is worry about how we're going to point the object in that direction that we want it to move. Now we'll add a collision shape. So add a child node, collision shape. And over here in the shape property, we'll add a new box shape. Click into the box shape. And the extents, these are half bounds, so make them half the size of your mesh. And there we go. Let's save. Okay, now let's create a script for this projectile. Attach a script. So what we want our projectile to do is just move forward. So we'll add that in for now. And we want this in the physics process because we are taking collision info. So in the physics process, we are just going to move and collide in the forward direction. Going to multiply this by delta, the time increment, for every physics step. And it's good practice to export a private field called speed, so we can change this dynamically. And multiply this by speed. Okay, let's go back to our main level. Underneath the player, we're going to create a new spatial object, which will be the origin of the instanced projectiles. So underneath the player kinematic body, let's add a child node, a spatial, and we'll call it player fire. Let's attach a script. In our player fire script, let's create a function, a method that will create projectiles. So we'll call that a private void. We'll just call it fire. But what are we instancing exactly? Let's create a field here and we'll export it so we can edit it in the editor. Now the type of variable here is a packed scene. So when you save scenes into your project as scenes, these are basically like prefab objects if you've worked with Unity before, and you take this packed scene and then you instance it as a node, and that's how you generate objects dynamically at runtime. So this packed scene, we're going to call it projectile scene. Now we can leave this as null for now, and if we build it, you can see this projectile scene member variable here. You can load the projectile scene in here. Now alternatively, you can initialize this variable, and the way you do this is you use the resource loader singleton, use the load method of the type packed scene, and then you pass a string which is the path to the resource. The way you do this is you type res : and now you create a directory path based on your project hierarchy, based on this hierarchy here. So if this hierarchy changes, you got to be mindful of any strings that you've written. Alternatively, just make sure that this is always updated. Projectile.tscn. Okay, now when we're firing, we're creating a new variable called projectile instance, or just projectile, and then we take the projectile scene and we call the instance method. Now we've created an instance of the projectile, but we haven't actually added it to the scene yet. So what we need to do next is, let's look at our scene hierarchy. Our top level node is level manager. First, let me show you something first. Let's just use the add child method and we'll add the projectile. Alright, now if we press space, we're creating projectiles. However, note how they move with the player pad. And the reason for that is obvious. When we're calling the add child method, it's a child of the kinematic body. Well, specifically, it's actually a child of this spatial node. Now, as this spatial node is the child of this body, the origin of the player fire is affecting, because these projectiles are children of the player fire, as they're moving around, their relative position changes as well. So instead of adding the child to this node, which is what this script is attached to, you just add it to the top level scene. Get tree dot root and add child. Okay, now they're being added to the global origin. So let's fix that. So the projectiles transform should be set to this, which is the player fire global transform. Now you'll notice we've got a red underline here. That's because of the node instance here. Because this is instantiated as a node, it doesn't have a transform property. So you'll have to typecast this to a spatial node. The other thing we noticed is that it's moving towards the camera, so let's also rotate it. We use the lookat method. Now what the lookat method is it points the local -z coordinate, that is the local z forward basis, towards the target position. which is a global position, mind you, and you specify another vector, which is its local up. In this instance, it doesn't matter because the projectile can be oriented at any phase. So what's our target? Well, it's the up direction at the location of the player base. So we'll take this global transform and we'll take the origin. The origin is the base of the player. So the player pad is somewhere here. This is the origin. And we want the instantiated projectiles to look in the up direction. So some imaginary point up here. So the simplest way to do this is to just take the player origin and add a simple up vector. And this will result in this vector, its position here, which the projectile will look at. So take the global origin of the player via spatial node and just add a vector3 dot up. Multiply that by say 5, that will give us that. And so the vector3 up argument, again, if we're looking in this direction, it's arbitrary what the up direction is. So we'll just make this vector3 dot right, as long as it's at a right angle. Alright, let's test this out. 2 minor errors I made. The first is to update the position of the node and the rotation after you instantiate it to the scene, after you add it to the scene. And the other is for the projectile, we're not moving it towards vector3.forward. Yep, we're moving it towards the basis, which is the local Z direction, the local forward direction, which is what I discussed in my earlier video about transforms. And the other issue is at the rotation, this points the local minus Z axis towards that position, which is actually the backward direction. All we need to do is set this to vector3 dot down. There we go. Much better. Now our projectiles are colliding with our player. So our player has a collision property. Collision objects are members of layers, collision layers, and they interact with objects particular to that collision mask. So in other words, this player kinematic body is a member of these layers and collides with objects that are members of these masks. Let's go into project setting, input settings, general, layer names, and 3D physics. Let's call layer 1 the player, layer 2 projectiles player, layer 3 projectiles aliens. So it's on layer 1. We don't need to check for collisions with the player node, there's only one player. And we also don't need to check for collisions with projectiles, with player projectiles. The player cannot collide with his own projectiles, but he can collide with alien projectiles. Now in our scene, let's go into collision, and we'll switch off the mask for the player. And we'll make it on layer number 2, which is the player projectiles. There you go. Now they no longer interact with each other. Now let's set up a fire rate. Let's export float called lifetime in seconds. And let's say that projectiles only last for 2 seconds. Let's export private float called the fire rate. And we'll say 1 bullet a second. Now to keep track of time, let's create a private float called elapsed time, which by default defaults to 0. It's a numeric value type. And a private float time of last fire. And so during the process, what we do is the elapsed time, we increment it by the delta. And in this if statement, we have to check that if the action is pressed, fire, and the elapsed time, if the elapsed time is greater than the time of last fire plus the fire rate. The last time a projectile was fired was at 12 seconds, then we'd have to check to see if the elapsed time is at least 13 seconds before we call the fire function. And after we do that, we set the time of last fire to the elapsed time. There you go. Can only fire once. Now this code is a little all over the place because we're taking inputs from the keyboard and from the touchscreen button, which we need to set up next. So it's actually a good idea to pull a lot of this logic into the fire function. So here, let's check if the elapsed time, we'll basically take this statement here and put it here. And here we're to check if it's actually less than, then just return. But if it's not less than, then we can take this piece of logic here, we execute the rest, and we update the time of last fire. And this cleans up our main process function a bit. Alright, now let's set up a signal to the touchscreen button. And I've shown you how to do this in code before, but I think in this instance we could just do it in the editor. So go over to your fire button, click on node, and this is your pressed signal. And we're going to connect it to our player fire node. And the receiver by method is fire. That's it. And connect. And as you can see, our fire button works. However, you can't hold it down. So you'd have to continuously tap on the touchscreen to execute the fire button. So if you want an auto fire, you'd have to check for a screen hold event in the script, which is what I showed previously for the touchscreen camera and for the joystick input. Alright, I think I will stop this tutorial here. In the next episode, we'll add an alien and show how to handle collisions between objects on different layers and different masks, and handle node destruction. Thank you for watching. If you have any comments, questions, suggestions about this tutorial, please don't hesitate to put them in the little box down below. Hit like and subscribe and hit the bell as well. And stick around if you'd like to see some of the buildings that I've pulled together for my own project. Alright, let's take a look at city number 3, Hong Kong. So the first one is the Bank of China Tower. Now I said I like to avoid skyscrapers. Certain skyscrapers are so iconic that you can't avoid them. And the Bank of China Tower is quite a beautiful one. Of course, Hong Kong is nothing but skyscrapers. It's a very vertical city. So I've actually designed 2. The 2 International Finance Center. Perhaps not as iconic as the Bank of China, but it is a very tall building. And I got lazy. The third building is the Hong Kong Clock Tower, British era relic from Hong Kong. This is a beautiful little auditorium, the Kei-Kao Auditorium. It's an egg-shaped building with a skybridge entry. This is a bit of an unusual one, Peak Tower to Hong Kong. Now this building looks different in real life from different sides. So you'd notice that this little half pipe shape here has a different front and back. I did model those, however I did not model the difference because it is built on the side of a hill. It's different heights, the facades. I did not model that, I rather just copied this facade onto the other side. So I took a bit of artistic license here. And so the final building for Hong Kong is this beautiful temple here, Wong Tai Sin. Always dreaded trying to represent Asian architecture in these low poly styles because of the amount of curvilinear forms and just the sheer amount of detail, as you can see here. However, I think the high pixel density and the simple roofs actually work quite well. Alright, let's head over to Korea. This is Seoul, the 63 building. It's a very shiny golden skyscraper. So it works very well with my yellow scented color theme for the the buildings. It's very luminous. You look at it from Google Earth, it looks like a polished mirror. So in the material shader, I made the entire building metallic. Not sure how I feel about the model for this one here, the Dongdaemun Design Plaza at Seoul. It's a Zaha Hadid style buildings. As you can tell by the extreme curvilinear forms. I might revisit this model just to do the original building a bit more justice. So here's another beautiful building in Seoul. It's Gyeongbokgung Palace. And in particular, although the palace complex is quite huge, what I modeled here is the throne hall, which I think is the main building of the palace. And of course, Korea has a long Christian history, so I thought I'd model one of the churches as well. It's a major landmark in Seoul, the Myeongdong Cathedral. This is one of the observation towers in Seoul. It looks a bit like Telstra Tower at Canberra, and a bit like Sydney's Centrepoint Tower. And finally, another skyscraper. This is the Lotte, I think, the Lotte World Tower. And this is the tallest building in Korea and one of the top 10 tallest in the world, 555 meters. So let's switch over to China, and these are the Shanghai buildings. When I first saw this building, I thought I have to include this on my list. This is the Shanghai Art Museum. Fortunately, because the red color is so strong, it doesn't really convey quite well in the pixel model because I am limited by that color palette. But I've kept it. I think it's a gorgeous building. So here's another Buddhist temple. This is the Longhua Temple in Shanghai. Again, this is quite a complex building, but I chose to model this tower structure here and a simple representation of this gate. Here's one that I thought fit in quite well with the game's theme. It looks like a UFO and a clamshell, so it fits in with the marine aesthetic of the Asia Pacific. This is the Mercedes-Benz Arena in Shanghai. Quite a beautiful building. Number 5 for Shanghai is one of the suspension bridges, or the cable stayed bridge rather, Nanfu Bridge. And finally, of course, it wouldn't be Shanghai without the Oriental Pearl TV Tower. It's quite iconic of its skyline. And speaking of iconic buildings, this is the final one, the World Financial Center. And the final level is Tokyo, which is what I hinted at in the prototype. Picking out landmarks for Tokyo was quite difficult because the area is just so huge. But I narrowed it down to six quite beautiful buildings. So this is Kabukiza Theater. It's a beautiful fusion of a Baroque, European Baroque architecture and traditional Japanese architecture. Now similarly, the actual building does not look like this. It's actually quite deep with a garden up top and a sky and a large building on top of it. So I took some artistic license just to make it look like a theater. So this one is another temple complex, the Meiji Shrine. So I simply took one of these buildings, this facade here, and turned it into a building, and I added this torii Shinto gate at the front. So number 3 for Tokyo is this cocoon looking building here. I think it's called Mode Gakuen. I can't pronounce names. It's got this exoskeleton lattice arrangement on the facade, which you see in a lot of Japanese buildings. I wonder if there's significance there. It looks like it's enveloping something that looks like the gherkin from London. Number 4 for Tokyo is the Sensoji Temple. So here is another observation tower, the Tokyo Skytree. This is a very tall tower at 634 meters, one of the tallest in the world. And finally, I think most of you saw this coming, it's the Tokyo Tower. I actually like how this one came out with the alpha channel pixels. Looking through, it adds a lot of complexity, apparent complexity to the model that otherwise isn't actually there. Alright, well, thank you for watching, hope you enjoyed that. I've completed the first 36 buildings for the Asia Pacific region. So the next step is to build the player models. That's the ships that the player can unlock in completing the game. And after I show you those models in the next episode, the coding and assembly for the main project will begin. And I intend on completing the first vertical slice of the project, which is the Asia Pacific region. So getting the game highly polished with just those first 6 levels before I move on to the next region, which would be the Americas. If you have any comments, suggestions, questions, please put them in that little box down below. If If you like these videos, make sure to hit like and subscribe and hit the bell as well. And I will see you in the next one. Thanks guys.